And aha, there we go. Okay. Hello, everybody. One technical hiccup on the start, but it looks like we're live on YouTube. So my name is Sean Courage, and I'm a professor of Canadian and environmental history at York University. And I am I'm a historian of energy as well. I do research on oil pipelines in Canada in the mid-20th century. So I'd like to introduce you to this roundtable here, which was originally scheduled to take place at the annual meeting of the American Society for Environmental History's 2020 meeting, which was of course canceled due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but we're holding an alt ASCH 2020 session here live on YouTube. So we've got a panel of presenters, all of whom are researchers in the field of energy history. And we'll start with introductions from Ruth Sandwell.
Hi, I'm Ruth Sandwell. I teach at the University of Toronto. My background is in the history of the family and in the history of rural Canada. I recently, well, a few years ago now, edited a collection of essays called Powering Up Canada, History of Energy in Canada. I'm just finishing up a manuscript called Heat, Light, and Work in the Home, A Social History of Energy. And I've just submitted an edited collection on the history of women and energy.
Excellent. Okay, our next panelist on the roundtable is Caroline Debian.
Hi, Caroline Debian. I'm a professor at Laval University in the Department of Geography. I have a pretty interdisciplinary background. I've been working with Indigenous peoples and the effects of energy development, particularly hydro development, originally with the Cree and more recently with the Innu. And now I hold the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Heritage and Tourism. Glad to be here.
All right, our next panelist is Sakina Shakil-Grontmeyer.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sakina, as stated. I'm from the America Institute at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. I'm originally from Canada, but I've lived in Germany for a while. My research interests lie in contemporary history, really, crisis histories and energy history. And at the America Institute, I've taught courses on North American history with a focus on culture and crisis. But I am working on my dissertation right now, which looks at energy and crisis in contemporary North America.
Excellent. And our last panelist is Andrew Watson.
Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us. And thanks to Sean for organizing this great alternative panel for the ASCH. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of History in the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm a Canadian environmental historian. My research as it relates to energy as both some research that looks at the role of energy in agroecosystems over time, as well as a project on the history of coal in Canada, basically from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century. So I'll be speaking largely as it relates to that project on the history of coal in Canada today.
Okay, so I think as many in our audience understand that this is a relatively new format for most of us. And I think at least for most of us on the panel, this is our first time live on YouTube. So for those of you who are watching on YouTube, there is a chat room where you can post questions for the panelists on the roundtable. We're going to go through short presentations from each of the panelists, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. I've also got a list of discussion questions to get things going from the start, but please feel free to post your questions in the chat room, and then I'll relay them over here to the rest of the group. So we're going to begin with Ruth, who's the first up on this session.
Thank you, Sean. And I'll just begin with a brief apology that in the interest of time, I'm going to read my paper, but you'll have more entertaining presentations with as the other speakers come up. Energy history is indeed changing the way that historians understand the past, but I'll suggest today that nowhere is the social history of energy less developed than in exploring the role that gender has played in the last energy transition. This paper will briefly provide 3 reasons why this is a problem that should be remedied as we move towards the next energy transition. My first point is women do not appear very often in histories of energy, but when they do, their relation to energy seems very different than men's. We know a lot about men's role in energy transitions now, their inventions in labor and their planning and development for systems of financing, organizing, selling, running, repairing, and maintaining the new networks of power. Women occasionally appear as energy actors, but usually outside of energy histories, and almost exclusively in their role as the late 19th and 20th century wives and mothers, who, as designated homemakers, consumed new forms of energy, such as electricity and gas, and were either oppressed or liberated as a result, depending on the historian. A few studies have also looked at the new women energy professionals, the home economics professors and classroom teachers, the appliance demonstrators, the radio and print journalists tasked with instructing wives and mothers about how to use the new forms of energy in their homes. Interesting and important as these studies are, they seem to confirm what the larger silences around women and energy suggest. Women's distinct relationship to the last energy transition remains largely unquestioned and naturalized the separate which women consigned. This leads to my second point. The silence of energy historians about women today is nevertheless particularly puzzling in light of the detailed research by an earlier generation of historians who clearly identified the family and then gender as categories of analysis to understanding this. Learning from the tremendous variance, the process of first proto-industrial across Europe and North America, historians in the 1970s and 80s established a broad consensus that industrial gender distinctions in industrial societies and in ways that generally disadvantaged women. Let me elaborate on this second point. Micro-historical studies suggested that industrialization, in fact, comprised a kind of double gendering effect on society. The first was caused by women's decreasing access to productive labor and their consequent loss of economic power relative to men. While relations between men and women in early modern Europe were not equal, women's work as rural laborers, as dairy producers, as domestic servants, as spinners, weavers, and petty commodity producers in national and international trade networks, as businesswomen and as mothers, was part of a range of recognized activities by which households had traditionally wrested a living from local environments in pre-capitalist societies. But as direct access to food and fuel was increasingly blocked and production began to move out of the home and into workshops and factories to be performed for wages, the roles of women and men began to diverge sharply. Although women, like children, were initially welcomed into the new factories by industrialists interested in their traditionally low pay scales, a nascent male labor movement and a growing bourgeois ideology increasingly consigned women to a domestic role inside the home. So here is the other gendering movement, the devaluing of women's labor. As industrialization progressed, women wage earners were in effect enrolled in the so-called secondary labor workforce, comprising a reserve army of part-time and casual labor that was drawn on when men were either unwilling or unable to work. Women's labor in that informal economy also became increasingly disparaged, undervalued, and indeed not even recognized as work. Numerous studies over the years have demonstrated that women's unpaid labor, while largely invisible, has in fact remained vital in supporting households and community through such activities as cooking, gardening, scavenging, piecework, laundry, borrowing, sharing, and of course the caring and social reproductive work for which women continue to be primarily responsible. This leads me to my third and final point. The particular gendered inequality accentuated by that original shift to fossil capital is intensifying and is felt particularly strongly now as climate crises begin to engulf the world's poor. As Nancy Fraser has argued, while Marx originally articulated the sphere of production as the crucial hidden abode of capitalist relations, the ruthless exploitation of the environment and the staggering persistence of economic inequality around the world since his time provide two other unacknowledged and free supports of modern industrial capitalism. Fraser argues that women's labor comprises another another of these hidden abodes. Their unpaid work, though providing vital support for the functioning of fossil capital, is ignored, seen as being outside the legitimate concerns of the capitalist economy. As women moved increasingly into the paid workforce in the late 20th century, they have done so overwhelmingly into fields of care work that, because gendered female, continue to be undervalued and underpaid as a result. In conclusion, I'm suggesting that women's invisibility in energy history is a problem that requires explanation and redress. The ideology of separate fears that's been tacitly invoked to somehow naturalize and explain women's distinctive invisibility in energy transitions is instead an unacknowledged result of industrialization. Women's historical invisibility not only obscures the importance of gender inequality in the history of energy transitions, but in the process, it's still recapitulating the ongoing gender hierarchies, the different valuations of the work that men and women do that provide the structural, if largely invisible, support to fossil capital. This is why understanding how gender, in addition to race and class, worked in structuring the last energy transition must play a vital role in negotiating the next. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. I'm just going to switch the video over, and the next speaker is me. So let me get set up here and see if this all works. So find my notes. Okay. So my own research is focused on the history of the development of long-distance oil pipelines in Canada. And in the work that I've done, I think it starts to intersect with some of the core questions of this roundtable concerning the relationship between energy infrastructure and modernization in Canadian history. So this map here shows a contemporary look, bird's eye view of Canada's major oil and gas pipelines, which are regulated by Canada Energy Regulator, formerly the National Energy Board. And this is approximately 73,000 kilometers of oil and gas pipelines that stretch across the country. Many of the characteristics that came to define modernity in Canada in the years after the Second World War were enabled in part by a rapid transition to a high energy economy powered by fossil fuels. Mass automobility, automated home heating, commercial aviation, continental trucking, and much more changed the lives of ordinary Canadians. The benefits of that high energy economy were, of course, not realized in an equitable manner. The wealth generated from the massive scaling up of energy consumption in the second half of the 20th century was distributed inequitably, and the environmental risks associated with the fossil fuel economy were not felt among different groups of people in Canada in equal measure. But while fossil fuels and the energy infrastructure that was necessary for their distribution and consumption enabled many of the elements of modernization in post-war Canada, their development was also driven by prevailing ideas of modernity and progress themselves. Today, pipeline development has become a flashpoint of political and environmental activism in Canada and elsewhere in North America. It's become entangled in a range of issues, which includes both Indigenous rights as well as environmental issues like global warming. Proponents and advocates for pipelines today argue that these critical pieces of energy infrastructure are necessary for the Canadian economy because they'll generate jobs largely in construction of the pipelines themselves and in oil production in northern Alberta. When corporations built the first systems of long-distance oil pipelines in Canada in the mid-20th century, the politics of pipeline development were quite different. The construction of oil pipelines was motivated in part by ideas of progress and modernity. Oil pipelines, according to proponents and advocates, would make life in Canada better, not just because the construction of the pipelines would provide jobs or the infrastructure would support more oil production in Alberta, but because they would provide cheap, plentiful supplies of oil to fuel the modernization of the economy. So the next slide, I think, illustrates this point pretty explicitly. This is an editorial cartoon that was published in the Regina Leader-Post in October 1950 on the day of the opening of the first segment of the Interprovincial Pipeline. This was the first large-scale, long-distance oil pipeline built after the Leduc oil strikes in the late 1940s. It travels from Edmonton in Western Canada and connects to refineries in central Canada in Ontario, and ended up traveling as far east as Montreal. This cartoon represents, I think, the discourse of pipeline proponents and advocates in mid-20th century Canada, a discourse that linked oil and pipelines with progress and modernity. The image shows the first segment of the pipeline and the Alberta oil fields on the horizon, delivering crude oil to Saskatchewan refineries, represented by this tall gas pump labeled Monument to Enterprise and Progress. In the foreground, we see an enormous pump filling a line of modern machinery of the farm economy of Saskatchewan, including cars, trucks, and tractors. Premier Tommy Douglas spoke at the formal ceremonies that marked the opening of the pipeline. According to the Leader-Post that day, Douglas made reference to, quote, Napoleon's famous statement that armies marched on their stomachs, and that today the modern industrial economy marched on oil. The pipeline was economically significant, not just because it traversed Saskatchewan and provides some jobs for its construction and maybe the operation of pump stations, but because it would supply Saskatchewan with cheap, plentiful oil. In BC, we find similar rhetoric about modernization and progress and industrial development at the opening of the Trans Mountain Pipeline in 1953. This pipeline traveled in the opposite direction from Edmonton to Burnaby, British Columbia, delivering oil from the fields in Alberta. Once again, the opening of the pipeline was celebrated for coinciding with immediate drops in the price of gasoline, prompting ambitions for future industrial expansion and modernization of the BC economy. This was especially important in a province that had experienced gas famines during the 1930s as a result of its dependency on California oil producers who had cut supplies to British Columbia in response to price controls that were issued by the Premier of BC during the Depression. In his editorial memo on the day of the opening of the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the first deliveries of oil to the storage farm in Burnaby, the editor of the Vancouver Province, Harold Torchy Anderson, wrote, Thursday was a big day for Burnaby. It was a big day for Vancouver. It was a big day for BC. Again, the promise wasn't solely about jobs tied directly to the pipeline itself, but to the oil that would flow in ample quantities at low prices to power BC's industrial growth. The rhetoric of modernization that surrounded oil pipeline development in mid-20th century Canada was, of course, not unique. It was a piece of the period of economic growth across the country and part of a general faith in modern technologies to bring prosperity to Canadian households. It shouldn't surprise us to find this rhetoric applied to the sources of energy that powered those technologies, or many of those technologies, and enabled this prosperity. Fossil fuels powered modern life in post-war Canada, and the expansion of the infrastructure to access those fuels was driven by the expectation or the promise of a better life. All right. So the next speaker is Carolyn, and I'm going to unmute your microphone.
Let's see. Oh, I have to. Is this showing up in the right way?
Yes, it is. There you go.
Perfect.
And my voice, my sound is on?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good, good. Thank you, Sean. And I want to say that unlike Sean and Ruth, I did not write my text, so do stop me if it seems to go over a little too much. And I wanted to say before I begin also that this is kind of a strangely individualized experience, you know, speaking in front of a computer. I don't know who's listening to us, but I think Justine Gagnon, who's a new colleague at Laval University, she started on April 1st in confinement. A lot of what I'll be talking about today is based on her PhD research. I'm very glad that she'll be joining our department and looking forward to real time with her. So I just wanted to say hello to Justine and also to Adèle Clapperton Richard, who is probably out there too, who'll be a new PhD student starting this summer. And I have no doubt that she'll be focusing on gender and energy. So I have no doubt that I'll be very well surrounded by these colleagues. So I wanted to speak today about this question of decarbonization and energy transitions and see whether these are indeed new frontiers of extraction for the indigenous people of Quebec. And I originally thought I would refer to the Cree also, but this time being short, I'll just be speaking about the rivers on the North Shore. And let me move to the next. So I won't be going over, I think this is familiar to most people, how important hydroelectricity has been to nation building in Quebec. So I won't be rehearsing that argument here, but to begin with, I just wanted to outline how for Indigenous people in Quebec, both the Cree and the Innu, this time of nation building and dam building, which went hand in hand, mostly starting in the 1950s and throughout the latter part of the 20th century in Quebec, has meant intensive transformations of very important waterways for these people. And I think what we need to realize is that there is, as we might see it, as a second phase to this with the transition to green energy. So we've increasingly been trying to pay attention to how there are new pressures to develop and build dams on new rivers, and that there are a lot of the same aspects of the nation building discourse, that a discourse of progress, a discourse of modernization, that in some ways are very much in the background of the green energy transition. So of course, climate and economic crises of fossil capitalism make these energy transitions very urgent and indeed inevitable. But our work, I guess, is to pay attention to the politics behind that. And a little bit like Ruth was talking about how gender is always the hidden factor. Well, of course, race is as well a hidden factor of these green energy transitions. You know, this process of electrification and decarbonization. So we're really looking at how these new pressures are developing, you know, new frontiers of resource extraction for Indigenous people. A few years ago, the Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador, Ghislain Picard, he said that really the problem with hydroelectricity is that it's green, it has become green. So that creates even more of a challenge for Indigenous people because there's images so associated with green, with environmentalism. So how do Indigenous people develop a cohesive message around electricity when they do not want their rivers to be dammed? So in the last few years, we've been working with my students more closely with the Innu on the North Shore. And here I've included a map of just some of the infrastructures on Innu rivers on the North Shore. What's missing on this map is the lower North Shore with the Romaine project, which was really built for export, for energy exports to the Eastern United States. So this project is still being built right now, but its impacts have been very important for the communities are located around that river. But really what we've been looking at, and mostly with the work of Justine Gagnon, is the tension between the constant folding of energy development into the history, the national history of Quebec, and this sort of relationship of to these rivers as memory, as heritage. So, you know, this is a sort of a newer line of analysis for us is to see how the dialectics really between history and memory, and why Indigenous people in their relationship to that river it's always about heritage. It's always about remembering these cultural sites before the river was transformed. But there's really no way to bring in, I guess, that discourse into the larger nation building history around development. And add a more critical, I guess, aspect to that history. So Jonathan Laney, Wendat historian from Wendat, he talks in one article, he talks about the recourse to the past and how oral history or wampum belts have not always been legitimated as legitimate recourses to the past in order to show whether it's land occupation or, you know, the terms of a treaty, etc. We're looking at that same idea of a recourse, whereas nationalist history in Quebec refers to the dams or is projecting, you know, the representations of the dams as monuments of engineering, of modernization. The Cree or the Innu really want to document their immaterial heritage. And in the case that I will show, the project that Justine Gagnon did for her PhD, these submerged cultural sites are very much present in the contemporary relationship that people hold to the river, but they somehow don't weigh enough to be included into history. So they're being pushed aside as immaterial heritage doesn't stand up to the monumental discourse around the dams. So in a project that Justine conducted with the Innu of Pessamit, she reconstructed the old outlines of various rivers that have been dammed, and was able, working with people, to resituate their cultural sites using what the old contours of the river would have been. And through these maps that were very much like a bricolage, bring back the narratives into these landscapes from a contemporary point of view, in order to tease out, I guess, the relationship between the idea that these sites had disappeared, had just been erased by hydroelectric development. The idea behind the project was to show just how present they were still in contemporary times, and how people want to maintain this sense of place around this river, even though it's now a reservoir. So for us, the project, and here I have to move a little bit because I can't read what's on my slide. For us, the project was really about showing how the Innu cultural landscape and the hydroelectric landscape are clearly entangled. They're coterminous. They exist together in the same time frame. But the modernizing discourse around a monumental nation building, energy development is always that one phase of development replaces previous phases of occupation of the land, of the territory. Once the river is dammed, once it's transformed, that access as a cultural landscape no longer is possible for the Innu. And clearly the work that we did in this project shows that there are myriad ways of keeping that memory and that heritage alive. But the question is how to reinsert that into the dominant history of Quebec as a continuum of modernization. This history constantly seeks to neutralize the Innu's continued experience of these rivers as a social, relational, appropriated landscape. And here is an example of the new exhibition, the new Interpretation Center from Manic 5. We've gone through the entire exhibition, which was redone about 3 or 4 years ago. And there is no mention of the Innu at all. You know, the previous exhibition had no mention, and you would think that, you know, having it, since it had been redone, that there would have been a space for that counter history. As I understand, there is now at the site Sea Dam in BC, but clearly Quebec is not willing to open that door in terms of official renditions of its history around the dams. I'll go. I see that time is flying by. Just a few words about another site also that we've studied is Les Fourches Péribonka. This is the Péribonka 4 dam in the territory of the Pequot-Kaminuts. They're in the Lac Saint-Jean area, it was a very important gathering place in what was a larger cultural route of various rivers leading inland. But the particularly interesting, I guess, aspect of that site is that it hooks up to the idea of the Mimikwechat. They're supernatural beings in Innu history or immaterial heritage. They're beings that have the power to move freely between the world of humans and the world of supernatural beings. And here I've included from the master's thesis of Florence Parcoret. She was using the work of José Maillot to show a diagram that shows this corridor here where the Mimikwechat are able to go from one world to the other. And a lot of rock paintings actually in Ontario, it's been documented that some of them are representing the Mimikwechat. So they're a very important figure for Algonquian mythology and ideas about the land. This idea that they have the power to move freely between worlds, it means that encounters between humans and Mimikwechat are possible and do occur. And when we worked around this site in Péribonka 4, well, there's one family in particular for whom this experience was very, very important. Every time they would go to this gathering site, they would canoe by the site where the Mimikwechat might be encountered. And this was a very important aspect of their experience of that site. Now, and I'll go back to the first, the other, now this was the site where people used to camp. These are the turbines where the water comes out. So this used to be a kind of opening in the rock. Now these are the turbines. So the site is very much transformed, but this idea that the physical environment still may be a portal to go into the world of these supernatural beings is still very, very important for people, and a fundamental aspect of that cultural landscape that they want to maintain. So having done this work with 2 Innu communities, and hopefully we'll be able to work with people on the Lower North Shore as well, and what they're experiencing right now with the Romaine project, really leads us to ask, well, what is the place of immaterial heritage in energy landscapes? There are different kind of recourse to the past, and energy histories are so linked to modernization and nation building. How can we go against that grain and bring in, a different understanding of these landscapes, especially in the second phase, I think, of frontier extraction through green energy and decarbonization? We need to find ways to keep bringing back Indigenous people's sense of the past and recourse to the past as a legitimate narrative that should lead us to question how we do these energy transitions and how we do energy development. So I think that we're still faced with discourses and representations of energy that are still very much framed by liberal understandings of modernity as progress, and even more so in these green energy transitions, which are seen as still inscribed in that sense of progress. We need to move toward that, and if we don't, we're just not progressing. So how much of that idea of progress, which was so fundamental to modernization, is still being reincarnated into energy transitions at the moment? And well, finally, this work has also, and this is just, we're starting to think about this, is how Indigenous people have a different sense of the past. You know, I can't go into this very much, but the idea of a circular pattern, the cyclical nature of time, the reenactment of submerged landscape has shown how people are still very much connected. There's not that teleology feeling like one landscape was before and a new landscape of modernization and energy is now. There's a sense that no, this is cyclical. And with decommissioning of dams, I think a lot of Indigenous people are thinking also there might be a time when those dams are not there anymore. We have other ways of living on the landscape. We have other ways of producing energy. So how do we integrate that into alternative histories of energy and modernity in Canada and in Quebec is what very much this work poses for us in terms of questions. So thanks for listening. Hopefully I didn't run on too long. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. Excellent. So as we switch over to our next presenter, we've got Sakina coming up here. And thanks to our audience of 24 people watching right now. And I can see messages in the chat room, which is great. And I'm just gonna...
Caroline, mine goes in a bit of a different direction. It takes a foray into the transnational or the binational when it comes to energy in modern Canada. I'm basically going to talk broadly about the oil relationship between Canada and the United States in the 21st century. I'll focus on the politics and the rhetoric more on the Canadian side, but hopefully we can open things up a bit more in the discussion. So the United States is the single most important partner for Canada when it comes to oil. In the 21st century, the oil industry in Canada has undergone a tangible continental integration, particularly on the Canadian side where privatization has made it nearly impossible to disentangle American and Canadian interests. The Canadian oil industry was different throughout the 20th century as it was largely nationalized. The oil crises of the 1970s drove the Canadian government in an interventionist and nationalistic direction. At the time, energy security meant security of supply for Canadian consumers. A major goal of Pierre Trudeau's 1980 National Energy Plan was a Canadianization of the energy sector, which was unpopular in Washington, as well as with major American and other foreign-owned oil companies. Still, US investment and the growing network of pipelines played important roles in the exploitation of Canadian oil, for which the Athabasca oil sands in northern Alberta became the major source. Much changed in the 1990s. Petro-Canada, Canada's first national oil company, created by the federal government in the mid-70s, went public in 1991. And by 2004, it had become completely privatized. This privatization was accompanied by trade agreements essential to the integration of the Canada-US oil relationship. The 1989 Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement and the superseding NAFTA that went into effect in '94 both had special energy provisions that made it financially feasible for companies to finance new export pipelines from Western Canada through to different parts of North America. And what pushed the countries even closer together was the reaction to the events of 9/11. This really aligned Canada and the United States in terms of security strategy in the immediate post 9/11 period. Security became continental. National security for each country came to mean North American security. The term, which you might be familiar with, Fortress North America, became indicative of national security strategy, and this extended to energy. North American energy security came to mean US security of supply and how Canada could advance it. Some American companies wanting insurance from supply disruptions bought Canadian resources and corporations, while Canadian politicians and energy companies often use a security justification to build new pipelines and develop new sources of oil for US consumers. This included the substantial expansion of mining operations at the Alberta Athabasca oil sands, a base plant of which is pictured here. Still, in the 2000s, a greater goal was the expansion of the Canadian oil trade with the United States. A spokesperson for Enbridge, the multinational Canadian Transportation Corporation, said to the Globe and Mail in 2003, "What we want to do is move a lot more Canadian crude into the US market than anybody has ever seen before." The United States, as one of the world's largest oil consumers, was the main partner for growth. This, of course, was not without protest. The oil sands had become the key resource for Canadian oil, and the process to produce crude oil from the sands is both energy intensive and environmentally risky. Enbridge grew to be a target of environmental protest, as we see here in the image of the People's Climate March in New York City in 2014. The octopus is a trope often attached to oil companies, as some of you may know from the reputation of John Rockefeller's Standard Oil in the late 19th, early 20th century. Criticism connected to environmental concerns was launched not just against Enbridge, but the development of the oil sands more generally. In Canada, communities such as the Athabasca, Chipewyan First Nations spoke out against the environmental related health risks posed by oil sands development. Despite such criticism, increased investment in the Canada-US oil relationship continued with the election of Stephen Harper, for whom growing the oil trade between Canada and the United States was a key objective. In July 2006, in his first international speech made at the Canada-UK Chamber of Commerce in London, Harper said, one of the primary targets for British investors has been our booming energy sector. They have recognized Canada's emergence as a global energy powerhouse, the emerging energy superpower our government intends to build. We're a stable, reliable producer in a volatile, unpredictable world. That's why policymakers in Washington, not to mention investors in Houston and New York, now talk about Canada and continental energy security in the same breath. That's why Canada surpassed the Saudis 4 years ago as the largest supplier of petroleum products to the United States. Harper's motivation for the speech was to attract foreign investment in Canadian oil. His way to do this was by selling Canada's supposedly lucrative oil relationship with the United States. He also intensified the tendency to shift Canadian policy to align with US interests, particularly as geopolitical conflict with the Middle East persisted throughout the 2000s and increased pressures to reduce dependency on Middle Eastern oil. By the end of the decade, the Harper administration had planned an extensive energy advertising campaign in the United States. The campaign began in 2012-2013 as part of an effort, in part as an effort to woo American support for the Keystone XL pipeline from Alberta down to Nebraska. The billboard pictured here was in the metro station in Washington, DC. It stated, "America and Canada, friends and neighbors, America's best energy partner." And this was a phrase used throughout the campaign. America's choice, import oil from Canada, a secure and environmentally responsible neighbor, or choose less stable offshore sources with much weaker environmental standards. Canada delivers 2.4 million barrels of oil to American refineries every day through pipelines connecting Americans to a reliable source of fuel. GoWithCanada.ca. The Harper administration was not alone in the advertising game, of course. Canadian oil companies played their part. An example here is Cenovus Energy, an integrated Canadian oil company based in Alberta. Cenovus's advertisements, as with other Canadian oil companies, played up an environmentally friendly image. The advertisement states, "Welcome to a different oil sands." And in the text, the advertisement states, "While some of the Canadian oil sands sit near the surface, the majority is found deep underground." Innovative technology pioneered here in Canada allows us to reach that oil by drilling for it, so we disturb very little land. Discover more at adifferentoilsands.com. By the way, this tendency to build websites to provide an alternative vision against the critics of environmental hazards of the oil sands was really, really popular. It still is. Of course, the image in the advertisement depicts a very environmentally pristine oil sands, a stark difference to what the mining operations actually look like. Such advertisements could be seen in both Canada and the US, attempting to sway the increasing environmental and climate change related opposition to the oil sands and the companies operating there. Public opposition was and still is high. At the start of the millennium, further economic integration had become a priority for the Canadian business lobby. Both the Liberal and Conservative parties pursued policies based on principles of North American integration rather than ones counterweighing potential US hegemony. A nonpartisan alliance grew between corporate Canada and the federal government. Bilateral trade with the United States, however, doesn't always fit with public opinion. So businesses and business groups have made managing public opinion a priority. Much of that has to do with assuaging concerns connected to oil, the dominant ones being related to environmental degradation, which is addressed by advertising, such as the example here. The oil lobby in Canada was also quite strong. In 2011, a mysterious pro-oil nonprofit called the Ethical Oil Institute popped up in Alberta and embarked in a more explicit online advertising campaign for Canadian oil. The nonprofit, created by lawyers in Edmonton, one of whom was a notable conservative political commentator, Ezra Levant, used the angle that Canadian oil was morally superior. It was the ethical option, as both the advertisement and the name state. Many of the ads were comparing Canadian oil and Middle Eastern oil, of course, Canadian oil being the ethical option, but Middle Eastern oil was not the only target. It was really Canada versus the world, and Canada is always the ethical option. But such lobbying organizations, while they were successful in disseminating their message, they were actually quite short-lived. The ethical angle faded out against growing opposition based on criticism of the oil sands' heavy environmental and carbon footprint. So at this point, I would bring my talk to a close with the last image of a demonstration at the Alberta Legislature Building in Edmonton, where you see environmental protesters mixed with a pro-oil, pro-energy sign. The oil game in Canada continues to be complex. It's a mixed bag, and it would not have developed as it has without the United States as a primary partner. It's impossible to disentangle the Canadian and American interests in both oil sands development as well as protests against it. It's also unclear in what state Canadian oil would exist without US investment and purchasing power, and even less certain how Canada can make itself less vulnerable, as the future of oil and arguably of US-Canada relations seems quite murky. What is clear is that the 21st century marked a departure from how Canadian oil strategy was throughout much of the 20th century, a departure from nationalization into a privatized, integrated continentalism. As we are still at the start of the 21st century, there's much still that remains to be determined. So as historians, we have to ask ourselves, how else can we view the patterns of Canada-US oil dynamics? And how can we contribute to the greater conversation about energy and modernity in Canada? Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sakina. And our last of the panel presentations is coming from Andrew Watson.
All right, let me just get my screen set up here. So thanks to all the other presenters for putting out a set of really great ideas that I hope to build on a little bit. These are some not completely thought out ideas about the history of modernity and energy in Canadian history, but I'm going to try and tie them together, try to tie together the history of fossil fuel energy and the transition to fossil fuel energy, particularly coal energy in Canada, with the idea, with Ian Mackay's idea of the liberal order. But mostly I came to this idea because I have, I was trying to sort out how historians can grapple with what I see as some pretty big problems related to the discussions around the next energy transition towards renewable energy, decarbonizing the economy and society in North America and the planet more generally. And these three problems that I'm sort of grappling with or thinking about right now, that I'm trying to find ways to historicize a bit, are very simply reduced to we, in quotation marks, labor and liberal order, or maybe liberalism in general. So the first, thinking a little bit about what do we mean? What or who do we mean? Scholars and historians, when we often talk about, I keep saying when we talk about we, right? We use that word so easily, and it has actually come up quite a few times just in the presentations right now. When we think about an energy transition, we need to be careful about the way we lump together huge groups of people and the important disparities between groups of people when discussions about energy transition talk about we. Who is we? What is we? The second issue is thinking about the ways in which industrialized or industrializing places, countries around the world, and in this case Canada, might imagine decarbonizing the economy and society, confronts the sort of really profound changes in our relationship to energy, and in fact the average person's relationship with manual labor in particular, right? If we wanted to imagine a transition to non-mineral energy, then we need to grapple with the reality that a lot of people are going to have a new profound relationship with manual labor, somatic energy. And then the third issue, which kind of ties hopefully the first two together, the third problem is that if we want to fundamentally restructure or transform our relationship with energy, and we can accept that the modern economy and society in places like Canada are reliant entirely on cheap fossil fuel energy and abundant fossil fuel energy, then what does that say about the consequences of this energy transition to our relationship with liberal democracy and a market economy? How can we imagine a future that transitions away from fossil fuel energy if we can't also imagine transitioning away from liberalism and free market economies and liberal democracy in some way, shape, or form overall? So the first of these, grappling with we. These things, these claims that you hear talked about a lot in climate activism and even in conversations around a just transition is we have caused climate change, right? We need to use less fossil fuel energy. We need to decarbonize our economy and society, or perhaps we need to transition to a renewable energy society. When you hear that, the we in that discussion is not all of humanity, right? It's not a blanket statement that all people need to, that all people have caused climate change, that all people need to decarbonize. It's also even, it's largely a reference to groups of people who need to take responsibility for the creation, the transition to a full-fledged mineral energy economy, and those who need to confront fundamental changes to the economy and society. And so this is not just everybody around the world, it's particular countries, particularly the industrialized and industrializing countries in the world. But even there, right, even if we take Canada as an example of a country that needs to step up and take responsibility for the we inherent in our discussions, it's not everybody in Canada. Again, the we is still not everybody in countries, industrialized countries like Canada. There's stark inequalities inherent in the way we throw around the word like we or our in these discussions. So we, when we talk about we, fundamentally, masks inequalities, and we need to recognize as scholars and historians looking back at these subjects that energy is really a lens of analyzing inequalities, particularly when it comes down to energy transitions, right? And so how can energy historians offer a way of interrogating the ways in which the groups of people responsible for and subject to energy transitions mask a kind of inequality? Second issue that I've been grappling with, it's somewhat related to this we question in many ways, is this issue of labor and how important labor is in thinking about energy transitions, one that really does not get talked about in any detail at all, right? So renewable energy, green energy, is a sort of panacea, right? That especially renewable energy, electricity, will somehow replace all of fossil fuel energy, or at least a vast majority of it. And it simply cannot, right? There is not the capacity, there is not the material reality available to replace the extraordinary scale of energy that we rely on through fossil fuels. hydroelectricity, as Carolyn has outlined, but even the use of a lot of solar and wind energy relies on a variety of materials from around the world that are simply not available in big enough supply to make this transition quick enough or on a scale necessary to easily just shift from one to another. And so when we think about the really dramatic change necessary to decarbonize our economies and societies in places like Canada, we really need to think about what it means for refamiliarizing ourselves with the kind of work that people and perhaps domesticated animals are going to need to perform to satisfy our energy needs. Grappling with that issue means grappling with issues of inequality. If we want to avoid old forms of inequality like indentured labor and slavery, which where a lot of energy was sort of mobilized in pre-mineral energy world, or the organic energy world, then we need to imagine how labor can be performed equitably in a decarbonized economy and society in ways that reflect the need to think about the we inherent in fossil fuels or an energy transition. And so this is another way that historians, I think, energy historians can assist here, right? Is to thinking about the ways in which the transition to fossil fuel energy, to the mineral energy economy in the late 19th or the 19th and 20th centuries was fundamentally one of replacing somatic energy with exosomatic energy. So something, again, that does not get a lot of attention amongst energy historians is interrogating how much the adoption of fossil fuel energies was largely, not strictly, but largely an exercise in replacing labor, human labor. And so these ideas then bring me to playing around with Ian MacKay's 2000 article about the liberal order framework, published in the Canadian Historical Review. I know lots of folks may be familiar with it, but just to give a quick overview, right? MacKay argues that one way of thinking about Canadian history is to study it as a project of liberalism or a project of the liberal order, and sort of pursuing Canadian history, the study of Canadian history, by looking at those who worked to realize the liberal order in Canada and those who worked to resist that project. Liberalism, a liberal order, largely being a way of sanctifying the primacy of the individual, the importance of the individual, the equality of all individuals before the law, and the importance, the fundamental importance of private property overall. So historians, I think, can contribute, right, to this effort to study the liberal order and think about Canadian history as a project of imposing the liberal order or resisting the liberal order by including the materiality of fossil fuel energy and realizing that the liberal order was co-created, to use some ideas from Timothy LeCain, his book on the matter of history. The liberal order in Canada was co-created with the materiality of fossil fuel energy. And so simply put, the liberal order was really not possible, right? The ideas existed, certainly, as MacKay and others have argued. The ideas of liberalism existed before fossil fuels became widespread and adopted in many segments of society. But the ways in which the liberal order came to dominate the social, political, and economic realities of modern Canada were facilitated by fossil fuel energy. And in turn, the widespread use of fossil fuel energy was also facilitated by the ideas of liberalism and free market economics. So these ideas, and one thing I would say too, right, is MacKay, he looks at a lot of different facets of thinking about the liberal order, but he never once mentions energy, not even in passing. And in fact, the book Liberalism and Hegemony, which came out a few years later, reflecting on Ian MacKay's essay, also does not address energy in any way either. So these two ideas that I'm grappling with are the ways in which fossil fuels are controlled, right? The ways in which the fossil energy, mineral energy is directed towards particular purposes, but also the ways in which it's consumed, utilized by consumers, is, I think, an effective starting point for trying to analyze how particular groups in society mobilized liberalism, right? So those who are advocates for the idea of a certain politico-economic structure around the liberal order mobilized the idea of liberalism through fossil fuels, while other peoples tended to join the project a little bit later, only as their interests became co-opted within the liberal order framework as a way of, if you imagine the liberal order over time extending out to subaltern groups that Mackay refers to, like women, workers, indigenous peoples. You can imagine the fossil fuel economy also extending out at almost the same pace, right? So as liberalism is extended, so too is fossil fuel energy, and they go in lockstep. And then finally, why some groups were marginalized from the liberal order, continued to resist the liberal order, or chose to opt out of it entirely, as also a reflection in their relationship to fossil fuel energy. Some of the examples we've heard already from Ruth, Sean, Sakina, and Carolyn. So I think there's lots of ways that these ideas can be mobilized to think very thoughtfully about the role of fossil fuel energy in creating modern Canada between the 1850s, 1860s, and into Second World War. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully there's some points of discussion between all the papers that come out of this. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. So we're now going to move into the discussion portion of this roundtable. And we've got our audience of viewers out there in YouTube world. Andrew, if you want to turn off the screen sharing on your side.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah.
Yes, all.
Just give me 1 second here. Oh, wait. Sorry about that. Good.
There we go. Okay. Yeah. So I have some questions for the panelists as well, but I did ask people in the chat room to start posting their questions a little bit early so we would have them right away and not have to wait for the lag. But just for the audience, just so you know, there's about a 30 to 60 second broadcast lag on YouTube. So you'll hear our responses a little while after you post your questions into the chat room. But I'll just scroll up to the top. We've got our first comment rather than question from Peter Fortna, who directs us towards Sakina and says, I'd like to encourage you to push beyond the media campaigns and try to understand some of the real impacts of development on the communities and how they responded. For example, consider how development impacted the community of Conklin, causing housing prices to increase beyond what the local community members could afford. Beyond environmentalism, this impact is real. So I don't know if you want to respond to the remark or not, Sakina.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that's a really, really important point. In my presentation, I really focused on the high level federal kind of strategy that has been kind of taking place throughout the millennium or throughout the 21st century. But this is why presentations like Caroline's or Ruth's are so important, because the regionalism aspect is really, really undervalued and understudied. And it's so important to take into account all of these different dynamics that kind of clash but coexist within this oil dynamic, whether it be national in Canada or whether it be binational Canada, United States. There are so many issues that have to be considered. Like I couldn't talk about it because we had a time limit, but it's a very, very important point, and I'm really happy that you wrote that comment.
Okay, I've got a question here from Tina Liu for Carolyn. Hi, Tina. Great paper. How do Innu notions of nationalism and sovereignty compared to Quebecois notions of the same come to shape their ideas about development and energy?
Mm-hmm. Hi, Tina. Thanks for the question. Am I on? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Maybe I'll start with an anecdote. A few years ago, Ghislain Picard was invited at the National Convention of the Parti Québécois. And, you know, they were all very impressed to have him on and thinking maybe, you know, he's one of our own, and he started his talk by saying, "I'm a nationalist." And you could sense in the audience how thrilled, you know, the people had congregated. "I'm an Innu nationalist." And then, you know, then there was a different kind of reaction. That's been taken up over and over again. Indeed, like there's always a sense that is very ambiguous. If you look at the Innu, they're Francophone, and many of them don't actually speak English. So the nationalism can be Innu, but there is sometimes affiliation also with not Quebec nationalism, but certainly the linguistic aspects of Quebec culture, because that's their main language, although there's a lot of language revitalization. But that's very different with the Cree. As you know, Tina, and I don't know who else is in there, you know, hydroelectric development has been almost like the quiet revolution for the Cree. You know, it's brought them into more of a nation state kind of framework where rapidly they built their own institutions, their own nation building institution, the Grand Council of the Cree, the flag. You know, they created very rapidly a political structure that really functions like a nation state, but is inserted within the Quebec nation state. That hasn't been the case with the Innu. They right now have a structure for La Grande Nation. They call it the Great Innu Nation, but again, in a very ambiguous and contradictory way. La Grande Nation Innu is spread across Labrador and Quebec. So in itself, that's also a problem. So I would say that there is a lot of efforts right now, nation building within the Innu, but it hasn't been as smooth and as easy going. It's almost as though the political, economic, and cultural circumstances were not brought together in the same way that they were for the Cree. And so the process of nation building, I guess it's a different thing, nationalism or nation building. But just to wrap it up, I would say that in Quebec, we have a very, as close as you can get to an Indigenous nation state with the Grand Council of the Cree. And hydroelectricity and energy development, forestry, mining have very much been a part of the engine of that nation state or national development. Whereas with the Innu, the same circumstances and cohesiveness has not been so easy to come by. And so the efforts are certainly, I would say, more arduous at the moment.
Okay, I've got a question for Andrew here from Clarence Hatton, who writes, "I agree that the affluent and powerful within industrialized countries have played an outsized role in energy transitions. Degrees of responsibility surely aren't evenly distributed, but that doesn't mean that energy transitions result from some kind of top-down manipulation. So how can we explain that consumers choose to adopt these fossil energy sources?"
Sorry, what was the last part of that? How can we
explain that consumers choose to adopt these fossil energy sources?
Fair enough. I mean, this is maybe part of the liberalism part of the argument, right? Is that increasing numbers of people are co-opted into a mineral energy regime because their standard of living, right? Their quality of life is they're told that their standard of living, their quality of life will consistently improve. I think of, Ruth's work here on the pedagogies of the unimpressed, and even some of the arguments you just made in your presentation about trying to send out Alberta oil into Saskatchewan and improve the lives of farmers, right? That constantly the messaging it's being pushed from producers towards consumers is that your life will get better if you adopt fossil fuel energy. You will become freer. Your life as an individual will become enhanced, right? Your role in the liberal democracy will become affirmed and defended through your use of fossil fuel energy. So avoiding the use of fossil fuel energy, right? Becoming one of those outliers, these subaltern weirdos that doesn't become part of the system, it means that your life is going to be harder, more laborious, inconvenient, and so all the messaging around this, right, is not necessarily that consumers don't have free will to make these decisions, but the ways in which the discourse is structured around fossil fuel energy makes it seem almost inevitable and undesirable to avoid being part of the mineral energy regime.
All right, I've got a question for Ruth. So Ruth, and this is my own question. Why, in your view, as a historian of the family, an energy historian, environmental historian, why do you think that new forms of fossil energy and new energy carriers like electricity sharpened gender distinctions, particularly around divisions of labor, rather than producing more equality between men and women? And looking historically at this, what do you think a gendered analysis of past energy transitions can tell us or help us to understand the potentials for future energy transitions?
Well, to answer your second question, I think that looking at gender can show us how important gender was.
Yes.
I'm writing that down.
So, and gender has not been looked at very much by the most recent, with some important exceptions, but it hasn't been at the forefront of the analysis in a way that I would say that race, and especially, Indigenous peoples have really been a big part of the history of energy for a long time in Canada, for at least 20 years, but in a way that gender has not. So, but there is, as I said, this huge body of literature that argues that analyzes industrialization in terms of the impact that it had on especially on women's work, women's labor relative to men. And that has just sort of been forgotten. So what I see in the energy history, which is fine and good, I see a lot of analysis of the results of what I would argue is the result of fossil capital on gender relations in industrializing societies, and they're, I'm getting a bit of an echo there.
I think it just stopped.
Okay, so I think that looking at gender allows us to see that, as I said, gender is played a really important role, and I would locate that, or I would follow the earlier historians writing about this to locate it in the removal of productive work from the home into factories, as Andreas Malm in Fossil Capital has sort of taken us back to all that literature, but he has not included the gender element in there. He's not looked at that, really substantial literature, really, really detailed microhistories of exactly what happened as industrial capital started to replace, to take work out of the home, put it in factories, and at the same time, which Mom does talk about, this huge labor movement that was really focused on men's right to to have a living wage. But in the process of that, one of the things that got thrown out was what would it take to make women's labor commensurate with a living wage inside a factory. And there were, people could have made choices, but they did not. So so simply looking at the results of that in the creation of the separate spheres ideology is just to ignore a causal structural impact of fossil capital on gender relations and on society. I mean, it was huge impact on the relationship between men and women, of women's limited access to money, which became more and more important through waged work. And so politically and economically, women were really disadvantaged. And they were women were also protesting all through the 19th century about this. So does that answer your question, Sean?
Yes, I think so. And the audience will let us know if it doesn't. I've got a question here for Sakina from Tina Lou. How does fracking and greater domestic U.S. production of oil, making them less dependent on foreign supply, change the relationship with Canada? What are the implications for the Canadian oil sector?
It's a complicated one. Fracking really changed a lot in terms of the U.S. attitudes towards oil, because a lot of it used to be connected to price, and price was often driven by Middle Eastern capacities. Of course, with fracking, the U.S. became a lot more independent, but the U.S. has actually been a lot more independent from Canada. The Canadian oil industry has really catered to the U.S. expectations for much of the last few decades, and that's really more of a problem for Canada than the United States. The United States has diversified in a way that Canada hasn't in terms of oil partners, and that's something that Canada, I think, really needs to take into account moving forward. A lot of the time, what really has brought the clash is not necessarily the oil prices or the oil industry, but rather like a clash of personalities when it comes to leadership. So that's something I think history can really teach Canadian politics and Canadian policymaking when it comes to partnerships.
Okay. We've got more questions coming in from the chat room. One for me from Ken Cruikshank. Ken writes, I would imagine that those who live in and around the pipelines might have had different views about where modernity would be located, and then asks, are pipelines less intrusive than hydro towers? Yes, and views about modernity and pipelines shifts and change depending on the constituencies that we look at in the past. In Canada, in the same period of that I was discussing in my presentation, when these sort of positivist advocacy pieces were being published in newspapers, sort of booster style articles and op-eds and stuff, there were groups who were beginning to express concern, including settlers and Indigenous people. So the first records that I've been able to find of sort of Indigenous opposition to oil pipeline development come from the Aamjiwnaang First Nation in Sarnia. So they had a long history with the oil sector in Canada that went back to the advent of the sector in the 19th century. And then their territories were, gradually taken up by the refineries and centers of production in the oil sector in Southern Ontario. And then their reserve was transected by the Interprovincial Pipeline in 1953. And they wrote to the Canadian government to request that the pipeline not travel through the reserve. There's also evidence by the later in the 1950s and 1960s of farmers in Manitoba and Ontario beginning to appear at Board of Transport Commissioner hearings and National Energy Board hearings to express reservations and concerns about pipeline development. There's a really interesting piece of testimony from a farmer in Southern Ontario who, in some ways, this was in 1961, I think, he is articulating what we might call a kind of proto-environmentalist argument about his concerns about pipelines, but he describes it as landscape change, that he's concerned that the pipelines are producing too much landscape change and that the land will be different for children in the future. But he insists that he's not opposed to progress and that he supports progress, but he's concerned about the effects on land that progress might have and whether or not there's a way to reconcile those two. Again, to partly answer the question, yes, if you were proximate to the pipelines, your views would certainly be different than those who were going to benefit from getting cheaper gasoline as a result of those pipelines construction. All right. Merle has some comments here. This is Merle Massey. I've been thinking about thinking strongly during the COVID-19 crisis about the role of energy and our everyday relationship with it and how it's changed so much since the last major world pandemic in 1918-19. In Saskatchewan, the physical act of getting out of bed to fill the stove, keep heat in the house, contributed to lengthening sickness and death in 1918. Now the energy focused on medical care, PPE, ventilators, hospital warmth, energy to run hospital equipment, beds, machines to test patients, et cetera, is an area for study. How do we balance energy requirements for modern healthcare, from running synchrotrons to vaccine development to patient care, with our need to reduce energy consumption? And I'm going to put that out to anyone on the panel who wants to take up some of Merle's comments about energy in the current pandemic.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
So yeah, this really picks up on Andrew's point. So Andrew, I won't say too much, but yeah, this whole question of energy sustainability is absolutely crucial to these to the discussions. And my feeling is that people. So the questions that Merle raised, yes, of course, how do we balance out? You know, the market has basically looked after that. I think in up until the present, with the government intervening as necessary, which we're also seeing with this pandemic in some very interesting ways. But no, those questions about who gets to decide how much energy goes to what, and who's going to provide that energy, who's going to consume it, and who's going to produce it with what effects, is absolutely crucial to this. And I don't think as a country we're even beginning to talk about that now, except for Andrew, who raised the question. But
I might just say, you know, one thing that often gets kind of glossed over is this: if we're going to decarbonize our economy, then we'll never use fossil fuels ever again for any reason. And that's not true, right? We'll use fossil fuels for all sorts of things. The point is to scale back significantly, dramatically, the amount of fossil fuels we're using. So the use of fossil fuels for all these applications, like saving people's lives in hospitals, or something like the synchrotron, or I can't remember what some of the examples are. It's not necessarily to imagine a future in which we have none of the things that maintain our quality of life, but to understand that in many ways we're going to have to rethink what quality of life is and have a new relationship with energy, rather than one that we just take for granted. Energy will do everything for us. Fossil fuel energy will do everything for us. Fossil fuel energy will do very particular things that as a society we just have conversations about how to distribute equitably.
So we're getting great questions from the chat. I'm going to try to get to as many as we can. I got a really quick one here, Andrew, from Tina Liu. She says, really, really interesting questions you raise, and important ones too. So an easy one back at you, which she has in brackets here, not. What does a just transition look like, given what history has revealed of past energy transitions?
Well, I'm not overly optimistic that that the next energy transition will go well. I mean, I probably put my money on catastrophic climate change and the collapse of our economy and society before I would imagine significant cultural change.
Okay,
but if we want
Andrew,
to just put a pin in that for a second, and imagine that we do have some sort of cultural shift towards an energy transition, I would say one of the first places to look at is, I'm thinking particularly of Justin Fisher's research with Climate Justice Saskatoon, where he went down in the southern parts of Saskatchewan to talk to residents in coal mining communities, to ask them, have conversations with them, you know, what does a just transition look like to you? To go talk to the people who are in the front lines of the fossil fuel economy right now, not those who are at the levers of power, who the CEOs of energy companies or even politicians, but the people who are actually going to experience the most significant shifts in their lives through a just energy transition, and have those conversations. Because if you can begin to accommodate the concerns and the desires and the fears of people who are the most reliant, and these workers, right, they're not the powerful people, they're not the we that I'm talking about, right? We need to have conversations with the people whose lives are going to change the most. And if those conversations can start to imagine a future that is agreeable and pleasant for them, then it's easier to have conversations with wider groups of people about what the next energy transition would look like. In other words, how can liberal order be restructured in order to accommodate the needs of the people who have been co-opted into it, rather than just simply expanding the liberal order some more?
Yeah, I mean, I think the history of energy transition, certainly the fossil energy transition in the 19th and 20th century, shows how much of the change that occurs is not solely driven by material changes. And in many ways, it's the social transformations that end up being more powerful determinants of the outcomes. So if Andrew had mentioned slavery as a massive source of somatic energy, which grew after Britain's industrialization. And in many ways, fossil energy fueled the most intense forms of inequality among humans that we could potentially imagine. So I think the kind of takeaway for a just transition is not to assume that technological or material transformations will be determinative of social outcomes, that social power continues, whether it's defined by gender, defined by race, defined by class, will continue, I think, largely to be the determinant rather than supranatural forces affecting change.
Can I just add something really quickly?
Mm-hmm.
I would just like to say, I think this is where like Caroline's topic is really, really relevant, because there's a real risk of kind of perpetuating the same inequalities when it comes to the green energy transition that is so like highly touted right now. So it really means that we kind of have to push ourselves to the limits of our imagination to think about how we can imagine a different way of living if we want to really have a just energy transition, as we've been discussing.
Yeah, and I just might put one more thing in there. Ruth and I were at a conference back in September on energy and scale in Calgary, and there were presenters there from Chile who were describing to us the dramatic transformation of their society and environment in the Atacama Desert in Chile, because of the large-scale mining of lithium for batteries for renewable energy, right? And so, if we want to imagine a transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, solar and wind, and the amount of battery power that's required to make that infrastructure work, then we are exerting violence and dispossession on indigenous people in places like Bolivia and Chile in order to extract lithium to maintain our way of life with a different kind of energy. So we renewable energy isn't going to save us from anything. It's going to perpetuate all the same problems that exist today, but perhaps address climate change. So.
And I guess these are some of the risks that Carolyn was raising in her remarks as well.
Absolutely.
If I can just add a little something, to me, that's really the fundamental question, is that we're always, and this is why from an Indigenous point of view, this is so hard to counter that discourse, is that in the end, whether it's about nation building and modernization of the Quebecois, the Canadian state, or whether it's toward that very sort of well-meaning, sort of moralistic transition to green energy, the answer is always the same. We need more energy. We always need more energy, whether it's green energy or not so green energy. And I think that's where we need to shift to other conceptions of time and, just be wary of how much that sort of like arrow of progress is still kind of informing the discourse. And from that shift, then start to ask questions that might lead us to different answers and different ways of thinking about these problems. And as Sakina was saying, just try to be innovative. I think we're really stuck in the same framework, whether we're talking about green energy or nation building energy.
Okay, we've only got a couple minutes left before this session has to end, and the break and refreshment session for everyone to step out and talk with each other can continue here at this imaginary conference.
I'm excited to look at the books.
But We do have a question here from Tina Adcock for Ruth, piggybacking on Andrew's presentation. Might the next energy transition have the potential to bring women's engagements with energy back to the forefront, given that it looks like it may be a shift toward more somatic or labor-intensive kinds of energy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a huge problem, as Andrew said. But so I'm just finishing up this research that's documenting in fairly minute detail all the energy harvesting work that women in the organic energy regime performed, and just how much of each day that took up of people's time and their physical energy as well as their mental energy. So yeah, I mean, that is that's one direction that our society could go. The problem is just the vast quantities of energy, like this Zoom call, for example. I mean, it's, this kind of streaming is using up, tremendous amounts of energy that have to be, so there's so many ways that we're not even conscious of the energy that we're using. I keep thinking of a book that I read called The Human Powered Home, that shows how you could do everything in your home, like running a dryer, or by using bicycle power. And it would take up most of the day, like actually just to do a load of laundry. But anyway, so yeah, I think there is tremendous promise. And I think that history is great in this way to say, no, we don't just need to look for new technological inventions in order to keep increasing, as we've been saying, to increase people's energy use. But in addition to cutting back, we can look to older practices that people have used since time immemorial to meet their energy needs.
And I should just add, Ruth, that the internet stream that I'm using here is being powered by a team of horses that are walking around in circles in my backyard.
That would be the case.
Okay, so we are now out of time here. I want to, first of all, thank everybody who joined us in the live stream for their questions and for watching the presentations. And thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Sakina. And thank you, Andrew. I'm going to stop the stream on YouTube and say goodbye to the audience out there.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you,
Sean. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for making this work.
Everybody. And this will be recorded and posted on the Niche website, which if you're watching this later recorded on the Niche website, you already know. So thank you for joining us, and please tune back in during the next pandemic for the next installation of our roundtable.
Oh.
All right, and streaming.